My name is Vivienne, I'm 31 years old, and on the night of my wedding, in front of 200 people, my mother-in-law stood up to give a toast and read a love letter out loud that my husband had written 3 weeks before we got married, a letter so specific and so tender that half the room was crying before she finished the second paragraph. My new husband was sitting beside me with his hand on mine and his eyes full and his face doing the thing faces do when they are performing an emotion, rather than feeling it, and I sat there in my wedding dress with 200 people looking at us, and I smiled the smile I had been preparing for 48 hours, because I had read that letter before his mother had. I had found it in his email 2 days before the wedding, and the woman it was written to was not me. I let her finish, I let the room applaud, I picked up my champagne glass and I looked at my husband and I said, "To us," and I drank. And I spent the rest of that evening being the most composed person in the room, because I had a plan and the plan required me to get through one more night. What happened the next morning is something his family is still talking about. If you have ever had to sit through the performance of a lie while the truth was sitting in your pocket the whole time, subscribe to Unspoken Truth, because what Vivienne did next required the kind of patience that most people will never be asked to find, and this story is just getting started. I met Marcus Webb when I was 26 years old at a gallery opening in Chicago that neither of us had particularly wanted to attend. He was there with a colleague, I was there with my friend Dana who had insisted. We ended up standing in front of the same painting for 10 minutes independently before we noticed each other, which Marcus later said was a sign and which I later understood was simply a thing that happened, not a sign of anything except that we had similar taste in art and had both arrived at the gallery slightly too early. He was 30, tall, thoughtful in the way of people who listen more than they speak. He asked questions and waited for the whole answer and remembered what you said the next time you spoke, which in my experience was rarer than it should have been. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, a quiet evening at home rather than a grand gesture, which I had told him early on was what I would prefer. He had listened and remembered and acted on it. I thought that meant something about who he was. I still think it meant something, just not enough. The engagement was 18 months, we planned a wedding that was ours in every particular, a venue in the West Loop that we had visited 3 times before deciding, a menu we had built together over several long dinners with the caterer, a playlist that represented both of us. I was the kind of person who approached things I cared about with complete attention, and I cared about this. Not the wedding exactly but what it meant, the beginning of something I intended to build carefully and for a long time. Marcus's ex-girlfriend was a woman named Claire. They had dated for 3 years before we met. The relationship had ended, he said, because they had wanted different things. He mentioned her occasionally in the way that people mention significant relationships from their past when they are trying to be honest with a new partner. I had met her once at a mutual friend's birthday party. She was warm and direct and exactly the kind of person I could see him having loved. I had filed her in the category of his past and not thought much more about it. I had no reason to think much more about it. For 3 years I had no reason, and then I did. The 2 days before the wedding were the particular organized chaos of 2 people trying to hold the logistics of a large event together while also managing the emotional weight of something significant. Marcus and I had agreed to spend the night before the wedding apart, a tradition his mother had insisted on and that I had agreed to because it seemed harmless and because Barbara Webb was not a woman whose preferences you declined without a clear reason, and a wedding eve was not the moment I wanted to spend on that particular conversation. I was at my hotel suite with Dana and my sister Lee. We had ordered room service and were watching something neither of us was actually watching, and I was doing the thing I did when I was anxious, which was checking my email compulsively, refreshing it with the frequency of someone who needed to feel like they had control over something, and I was on Marcus's shared calendar which we used for wedding logistics, checking the vendor confirmation for the following morning, when I noticed that his email was still logged in on my tablet from the previous week when he had checked something from it. I want to be honest about what happened next. I did not go looking for anything. I was checking the vendor email thread which lived in his account because he had been the primary contact for the catering. I found the thread, I confirmed the time, and as I was closing out of his account I saw a draft in his drafts folder with a subject line that was a name, Claire, just her name, dated 3 weeks earlier. And I sat there for a moment with my finger hovering over the screen and then I opened it. Because I am the kind of person who, when confronted with a door, needs to know what is on the other side. The letter was 4 paragraphs, handwritten in the sense that it had the quality of something written by hand and then typed, the kind of careful specific prose that people write when they mean every word. It was addressed to Claire and it told her that he had been thinking about her since running into her at a mutual friend's event 2 months earlier, that seeing her had reminded him of something he had not allowed himself to think about, that he was about to get married and he knew that he was not asking for anything, that he simply needed her to know that she had meant something to him that he had never properly said out loud. And there was a line in the 3rd paragraph that I read 3 times, a line about a version of his life that he had not chosen and that he thought about sometimes, a version that had her in it. I closed the email, I closed the tablet, I set it on the nightstand, and I sat in the hotel bed in the particular stillness of someone who has just found something that cannot be unfound. Dana was in the bathroom, Lee was asleep on the pullout, and I sat there alone with that letter for a long time, turning it over in my mind the way you turn something over when you need to understand its exact shape before you decide what to do with it. I want to tell you about those 48 hours because they are the part of this story that I am most careful about describing accurately, because what I did in those 48 hours is not what most people would have done and I have thought about it enough to know why I did it and I want to be clear about that. The first thing I felt was not rage, it was something quieter and more clarifying, the feeling of a person who has just understood something about the architecture of a situation and needs to see the whole picture before she does anything with that understanding. I was 400 days into planning a life with this man and I had found something that told me the foundation of that life might be built on something I had not been shown, and I needed to understand exactly what that something was before I made a single decision. Was the letter sent? I checked, it was a draft, unsent. Had it been sent at another address? I didn't know. Had there been contact with Claire beyond a draft? I had no way yet of knowing. What I had was one letter that was arguably just a man processing feelings he hadn't acted on, feelings that were real and significant and that he had not told me about. And the question I spent 48 hours with was not whether I was hurt, the question was what this specific thing meant about the specific person I was about to marry. I thought about 3 years of being listened to and remembered and shown up for. I thought about the gallery opening and the proposal at home and the playlist we had built together. I thought about the line in the 3rd paragraph about a version of his life he had not chosen, and I thought, he chose me anyway, and that choice is either real or it isn't, and I cannot know which it is until I ask him directly. But I was not going to ask him the night before our wedding, not because I was afraid of the answer but because I needed to ask him when neither of us was standing at the edge of the most public day of our lives, when the answer he gave me would be the true answer and not the answer produced by pressure and proximity and 200 people waiting in a venue. I needed to ask him when we were alone and the stakes of the moment were not distorting everything around us. So I made a decision. I was going to get through the wedding, I was going to be present for it in the way I had planned to be present for it, and on the morning after I was going to sit across from my husband and I was going to ask him about Claire and I was going to listen to his answer with the complete attention I brought to everything that mattered and then I was going to make a decision about what came next. Dana came out of the bathroom and found me sitting very still and asked if I was okay and I said yes and she looked at me for a long moment the way Dana always looked at me when she suspected I was not telling her everything and I said, I will tell you everything tomorrow. And she said okay and turned off her bedside light because she trusted me and I trusted her and that was enough for that night. The wedding morning was the particular choreography of a large event running on schedule, hair and makeup and the dress and the flowers and Dana straightening my veil and my sister crying before I had even put my shoes on. I moved through all of it with the focused calm of someone who has decided how the day is going to go and has committed to that decision completely. I was not numb, I was present. I noticed everything. The way the light came through the venue windows in the late afternoon. The sound of the string quartet warming up, the particular smell of white flowers and something catered and 100 people gathered in one space. Marcus was at the end of the aisle when the doors opened and I walked toward him and he looked at me the way he had always looked at me, with the complete attention that had been one of the first things I had loved about him, and I looked back at him and I thought, I know something about you that you don't know I know, and I am going to find out today who you actually are when the performance is over. The ceremony was ours, every word of it. We had written our own vows and as were specific and careful and the kind of thing you write when you mean it or when you are very good at performing meaning, and I sat inside that ambiguity through the entire ceremony and let the day be what it was. The toast happened at the reception. Barbara Webb had asked to give one and I had said yes because Barbara giving a toast was the kind of thing you said yes to unless you had a very good reason not to, and I had been choosing my moments with Barbara for 3 years. She stood up after dinner with a glass of champagne and a piece of paper she unfolded carefully, and she said she wanted to read something that Marcus had written because she felt it said everything she wanted to say about who her son was and what this marriage meant. She said she had found it on his desk at their house the previous weekend when she had stopped by to drop something off. She said she had read it and cried and asked if she could share it tonight. She said he had said yes. I picked up my champagne glass. She read, and it was the letter, every word of it, the 4 paragraphs, the careful specific prose, the line in the 3rd paragraph about the version of his life he had not chosen, all of it. Read aloud by his mother to 200 people who were crying before the 2nd paragraph because they heard a man describing the depth of his feelings for the woman beside him, and it was beautiful and specific and completely real. It was also written for someone else. I sat in my wedding dress and I listened to every word and I watched the room and I watched Marcus beside me, his hand on mine, his eyes full, performing the emotion of a man hearing his own words read aloud about the woman he had just married. And I thought, he doesn't know she chose this letter, he doesn't know I've already read it, he doesn't know that in this moment 200 people are crying over a love letter written to his ex-girlfriend and he is letting them believe it was written for me, and the question I had been sitting with for 48 hours was answering itself in real time. Barbara finished, the room applauded, Marcus squeezed my hand, and I raised my glass and said, to us, and I smiled and I drank. And I was the most composed person in that room for the rest of the evening. We got to the hotel at 11:30. The sweet Dana had helped me book 3 months earlier, champagne on ice that I did not open, Marcus moving through the room with the particular energy of a man at the end of a long day that had gone well, loosening his tie, saying something about how beautiful everything had been, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I waited until he turned around. I need to show you something, I said. I opened the tablet, I pulled up his email, I placed it on the bed between us with the draft opened. He looked at it and the room changed in the way rooms change when something that has been hidden is suddenly visible to everyone in them, the particular shift of air and light and the quality of silence that follows. He looked at the screen for a long time and then he looked at me and I watched his face move through several things before it arrived at something that was not quite any of the things I had prepared for. It was grief. Not guilt exactly, not defensiveness, grief, the grief of a man who has just understood the full cost of something he thought he had managed. I need to ask you something, I said, and I need the true answer. Not the answer that makes this easier, the true one. Did you send this? No, he said. Did you see her? No, he said. I ran into her at a party and it opened something I thought was closed and I wrote it because I needed to put it somewhere and I never sent it and I never intended. His voice broke. I never intended for any of this. I looked at him for a long time. I thought about 48 hours of sitting with this. About the gallery opening and the proposal and the playlist and the line about the version of his life he had not chosen. Your mother read it tonight, I said, to 200 people. She thought it was written for me. The color left his face completely. Every person in that room cried over a letter you wrote to Claire, I said, and you sat beside me and let them. Vivienne, he said. I know you didn't plan that, I said. I know your mother didn't know. I know the letter was never sent. And I also know that you have been sitting on feelings for a woman you used to love and you didn't tell me, and I found out by accident 2 days before our wedding, and I have spent 48 hours deciding what that means, and what I need from you right now is complete honesty about where you actually are, not where you want to be, not what you think I need to hear, where you actually are. He talked for a long time. I listened with the complete attention I had always brought to him, and what he said was honest in the painful specific way of things said when performance is no longer possible. He told me about running into Claire, about the feelings the encounter had surfaced, about writing the letter as a way of closing a door he had realized was still open, about deciding to go through with the wedding because he believed the life he had chosen was the right one even if it was not the only one he had imagined. He said that the letter was the end of something and not the beginning, and that he had not known how to tell me and had convinced himself that not sending it meant it didn't need to be said. I listened to all of it. I asked the questions I needed answers to, and when I had the complete picture I sat with it for a long time in the silence of that hotel suite with the unopened champagne on ice. Then I said, I believe you, and I need you to understand something in return. I found this letter 48 hours ago and I chose to marry you anyway because I believed that what we have is real and worth fighting for, but I need you to understand that choosing me means closing that door completely and telling me when things are hard rather than managing them in ways I can't see, because I can work with honesty and I cannot work with anything else. He nodded, and the nod had the quality of something real, the particular quality of a person who has been seen completely and is responding from that place rather than from the place they had been occupying before. We opened the champagne. We talked until 2 in the morning. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was our wedding night, and it was not what either of us had planned, and it was exactly what we needed. I told Dana everything the next morning over coffee. She listened without interrupting, which was how I knew she understood the weight of it, and at the end she said, "You sat through that toast knowing what you knew." "Yes," I said. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "That is either the bravest thing I have ever heard or the most insane, and I genuinely cannot decide which." I laughed for the first time in 3 days, the kind of laugh that happens when something that has been held very tightly is finally allowed to release, and it felt like the beginning of something, not the wedding exactly, not the conversation in the hotel suite, but the moment after, the moment when you have looked at the full truth of something and decided to stay anyway with your eyes open. That was 8 months ago. Marcus and I are still married. We are in couples therapy, which was my condition and which he agreed to without hesitation. We are learning to have a different kind of conversation than the one we had been having, more honest and less managed. It is harder and better simultaneously, the way things tend to be when you stop performing them. His mother does not know what the letter was. She thinks she gave a beautiful toast about her son's love for his wife, and she is not entirely wrong about that, just not right in the way she believes she is. I have decided that this particular truth is not mine to give her and not necessary for what I am trying to build. Marcus knows, I know, Dana knows, and that is enough. Claire is not part of our story. She never responded to the unsent letter because it was never sent, and Marcus has not been in contact with her, and I believe him when he says so, not because I am naive but because I have learned to distinguish between the things I believe because I need to and the things I believe because the evidence supports them. The evidence supports this. I think about the 48 hours sometimes, sitting in that hotel bed with the tablet on the nightstand and the decision in front of me. I think about what it took to walk into that wedding with that knowledge and stand at the end of that aisle and choose anyway, and I think about what the choosing meant. It meant that I understood something that took me a long time to learn, that love is not the absence of difficulty. It is the decision to stay in the difficulty and work through it with someone rather than around them. Not everyone would make the choice I made. I am not saying everyone should. I am saying that I made it with complete information and complete intention, and that it was mine to make, on my terms, in my time, without the room deciding for me. If you have ever had to hold something enormous while the world around you went on expecting a performance, I want you to know that the strength that takes is real and it counts. It is not weakness to choose the moment. It is not weakness to take the time you need. It is not weakness to walk into something hard with your eyes open and your decision made. You are allowed to know the full truth before you act on it. You are allowed to make the choice that is right for your specific life rather than the choice the story seems to require. You are allowed to decide that love is worth the difficulty of honesty, and you are allowed to decide that it isn't. Both of those are valid and both of them are yours. The letter was real, the feelings behind it were real, the 48 hours I spent deciding what to do with that reality were the most important hours of my marriage, and they happened before the wedding started. What I chose in those hours was not to perform a marriage but to build one, with everything on the table, starting on the very first night. My name is Vivienne, I'm 31 years old, and on my wedding night my husband and I opened a bottle of champagne and talked until 2 in the morning, and it was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was the real beginning of everything. Thank you for listening, take care of yourself, and if no one has told you lately that choosing with your eyes open is the only kind of choosing that counts, I'm telling you now.